Greetings, I'm Jean Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History. This month, we are joined by Dr. Julia Troche and Dr. Bryan Brinkman to talk about an upcoming exhibition at the Springfield Art Museum, which opens on December the 9th and runs all the way through to the 16th of June. It is called Ancient Artifacts Abroad, and it has been set up by Dr. Brinkman and Dr. Troche. Dr. Troche is an associate professor of history here in the history department at MSU and a specialist on ancient Egypt. And Dr. Brinkman, a returning guest, is an associate professor in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Religions, and a historian of ancient Rome. So welcome back, Bryan, and welcome, Julia, for your first visit to Talking History. So, yeah, let's get a little bit of background about this upcoming exhibition. What is it? What inspired it? And how are you guys involved in it?
So I'll take this one. The Ancient Artifacts Abroad exhibit was really something that was born out of a desire for Bryan and I to create additional high-impact experiential learning opportunities for our students. And in the past, our courses have been incredibly sort of material culture driven. And so we have taken students to museums. We've done a museum trip with our students up to the St. Louis Art Museum or Kansas City Art Museum. And we have a museum locally.
Also to the Louvre and the British Museum.
Yes, we've also taken students to the Louvre and the British Museum, fair point, when we did a study abroad trip. And we were thinking, though, hey, we have a museum here locally. Although there's no ancient artifacts on display, most museums have a few ancient Egyptian something hidden away somewhere. And so I called up Sarah Burr, who's the curator at the Springfield Art Museum, and asked her if she had any antiquities. And she said, yes, we actually have a couple drawers that we don't know exactly what to do with because no one's here is a specialist in that. And so Bryan and I went over to the art museum and started looking at the pieces. We had some students do some research projects on the pieces in various semesters over the last year or so. And now the exhibit is really built on both Bryan's and my research on these artifacts and our students doing some research. Our students are also looking at how, once the exhibit's up, we can think about public engagement. So they're also working on public-facing handouts and activities that we can do in conjunction with the exhibit. And really the exhibit is difficult and I think exciting because these objects have not been studied. They're not provenanced. We don't know a lot about them except for one or few pieces. And so this is the first time that most people will ever have seen them, at least in public display.
Dr. Brinkman, could you speak a little bit about the theme of this exhibition?
Yeah, one of the things we thought about as we saw the entire collection is that most of them had to deal something with travel. Effectively, whether it's reception when you come to visit somebody at their house, which is a number of our things, or something that people would take with them as they traveled. And we started to think about that and realized, something that's really interesting about it from our perspective, again, in the Ozarks is how are these objects here? Why are they here? So we kind of flipped the script a little bit and thought about these are the artifacts are the things that are abroad. They're abroad in the United States. How did they get here? And so we kind of have that dual conceit of the idea of how do they get into a collection like this, and how were they used in travel abroad in different ways? And so that's kind of the way that we've conceived of the general theme of the exhibit.
Can you perhaps outline what these artifacts that you found exactly were, and what does it mean within the context of studying material culture as a aspect of history? Obviously, when people think of history, often they think of archives, perhaps interviews with oral history, but often we think of artifacts in terms of archaeology as a separate discipline. But obviously, in recent times, there is a kind of convergence between historical methodologies. People who focused on documents are now looking more at material culture and vice versa. So could you put these artifacts in context? What are they and how does it fit into this study of material culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the big things is that most of these have to deal with sort of everyday experience. Even the things that are dealing at the religious level or the metaphysical level, they're things that most normal people would have with them in some way. And so that gives us a kind of insight that we wouldn't have from text because most people in the ancient world were not writing texts or reading texts. And so just that connection to them gives us a kind of level of the everyday. And again, what's exciting about it is that we have to remember that these are people who are moving around a lot, right? And sometimes like traveling vast differences, but there's still people that are engaging at the kind of everyday level, and what would they take with them? And so I think that's mostly the insight, is it gives us a different way to think about it than the kind of historical texts, which are pretty elite in most cases.
I'll add to that for example, some of the collection, we have 4 lamps. Now, the collection at large has a lot more ceramic oil lamps than just these 4, but 4 are going to be on display. And a lamp is something that seems fairly mundane, seems fairly everyday and quotidian, but everybody would use it, right? So everybody at all levels of society would need to use a lamp. Once, the sun is gone, if the moon isn't full, you don't have a whole lot of light. And so you need a lamp. And so we have some really basic ceramic oil lamps that would have been, again, a very sort of like everyday person's tool. But then we also have a really nice one, for example, from Iran that dates to the 8th to 13th centuries. And that date actually was discovered by a student of mine, Catherine Kirby, who was in a previous course, who did a lot of research on this piece in particular. But it's a beautiful turquoise, really fine fritware piece. And then another one that's also that would have been used probably by somebody of more elite society. And then another piece, another lamp, is also fairly basic. It's a medieval, or rather, this one's a late Roman piece, about 4th to 7th century CE, and it has a Christian cross on it. And so the great thing about that is it's an everyday lamp, but it also, through these sort of everyday objects, we can think about how not just people moved, but ideas as well, and religion.
So how did these objects get to the Ozarks?
That's a really good question. So largely, I think most of them, if not all of them, came out of private collections that were donated to the museum, which means that at some point people purchased them and then later donated them to the museum. The question of provenance is always an important one and something that we're aware of, but I think largely people kind of collected them here as interesting objects that they appreciated, and then at some point understood that it was important to give them to the broader community, and so donated them to the museum.
The vast majority of them were bequests from the Smith Holloman estate, so most of them came from one individual, but exactly from a private collection. And we do have a few pieces that we know of the historical origin or provenance because they're inscriptions that connect to them. So, for example, our sort of hero piece, the sort of one of the centerpieces of our exhibit, at least as for us, sort of that inspired our exhibit and sort of thinking about how we constructed it, was what's called an ushapti of Shed-Suhor. So an ushapti is a small figurine from ancient Egypt that you'd put in your tomb and could be called upon to do work for you in the afterlife, so you wouldn't have to do it yourself. And Shed-Suhor is the guy's name. And there actually are over 400 of these in museums like the Met, the Cleveland Art Museum, Cairo, the Louvre, etc. His collection is in Athens. He has nested coffins as part of this large, massive excavation that occurred. And so we actually have pretty good, this was in 1881 when it was excavated. So we don't have the best records. We actually have pretty good records of where this piece came from. And it's one of the few pieces that we really have pretty good find spots. So this would have been from a tomb in ancient Thebes, which is modern Luxor.
So how do you establish the provenance of many of these objects? Because, of course, forgeries are very common in this field, and you can do quite good forgeries nowadays. And some of the forgeries are very old forgeries as well, so they become interesting in and of themselves as let's say a forgery made in the 19th century to sell to Europeans, traversing the Ottoman Empire and British administered Egypt.
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll let Bryan take this one. But I think part of it's our experience as an archaeologist. So I've been in the field and I've excavated from secure find spots a number of objects of just about every form and type. And so from that experience, I have a fairly good sense, especially when you sort of pick something up and get to look at it and investigate it sort of in a really sort of close way, in a way that most people going into a museum don't have the access to do. I can kind of get a sense of, this doesn't quite feel right. The material should be heavier, or this doesn't have the sheen that it should have, or the color is a little off, and you can kind of get a sense of that. But there are some pieces that probably were sort of inspired by ancient pieces in the collection.
Yeah, and I like what you said. I kind of felt the same thing about, at some point you sort of get a sixth sense of the authenticity. Then you have to dig into them, but you get a sense of that. But yeah, one of my favorite pieces actually in the exhibit is a coin that when I first saw, I was really excited because it was really interesting and it was really beautiful, and it still is really beautiful. But it became clear once you turned it on the other side that these are two different original coins that were pieced, or I should say, the entire thing is probably a replica, but based on two different sides that didn't make any sense historically, and yet done really, really well. And the thing is, we have to keep in mind that there's a difference between a replica and a forgery, because they're not necessarily trying to sell these as fake objects by any means. For the most part, they're probably appreciation pieces that people had, and even pieces that were used perhaps for study or something like that. And so some of them, in that case, which I still really like that piece, was pretty obvious. And it just took like one flip around to realize it, and yet still can understand and appreciate it for what it is as a modern replica, trying to look at some of the best examples of coins from that period. This is an Augustan period, so the first Roman emperor period coin, so it's really interesting.
We also have some cameos that we're actually going to display in the way that they were preserved throughout history, so the way they came to us. So we're going to sort of show it in its longer historical context.
I'm really fascinated about how you kind of discovered that this coin was fake. So what was the kind of telltale? Why was one side, was it like inscriptions from one period and then an inscription from a completely different period? And you were like, well, these on their own might look good, but together it obviously means that this is either a replica or a forgery.
Yeah. So it actually has contradictory information. So it actually says on it the consulship. So this is for Marcus Agrippa, who's the kind of second in command under Augustus, and so a really well-known figure. And so we know we know his career really well. And one side mentions him, and both sides are real coins. It's just or based on real coins rather. It's just like combined together, and they give the consulship on both sides and two contradictory dates, which of course doesn't make sense. And obviously the person that put them together, I think, was thinking more aesthetically than they were about the actual information. And what we call the obverse, so the backside, basically, was pretty clear that in and of itself is usually one of the most copied styles of coins, and so that was a good indicator for that as well.
Could you speak a little bit more about the role that students played in the research on this project?
Yeah, so I had two courses, my ancient Egyptian history class and my archaeology and ancient history course, wherein students did research on most of the Egyptian objects and some of the Iranian, Persian objects as well. Most of the sort of Greek, Hellenistic, Roman objects I left for Bryan to sort of work on, since that's not my area of specialty. But the students have done a lot of really incredible work. One of the pieces that are going to show up in the marketing materials quite a bit is a bronze figure of Osiris. Osiris is an ancient Egyptian god of the underworld, of the afterlife, and a student named Susan Hardy was working on that in my class, and then she's actually continuing with Bryan currently in an independent study, continuing to help us with various aspects of the exhibition. So we have students who contributed as part of their course, but also are contributing in a more sort of robust way through independent studies. And then Bryan is also reaching out to his first-year honors seminar and asking them for sort of thoughts on, as we developed maps and as we're developing displays, just sort of getting another group of people's perspective, another contingency's perspective on how they would want to experience these objects.
Yeah, as Julie mentioned, it's really important for us to also use this as a pedagogical example and trying to invite students as much as possible to use these resources, which is what we should use them for in the museum.
Well, this is an extremely important point. Often people consider, history as a very abstract subject to study. It's a lot of writing, a lot of reading, but this is a very kind of practical use of those historical skills. Could you talk a little bit about, what you mean by this experiential learning, and how does it benefit students and people who are just interested in history more generally?
Yeah, so experiential learning is really about having an experience, right? An embodied sort of sensory experience that connects to your learning. And so we brought students to the Springfield Art Museum. They got to go and see actually some of the art objects, take photos of them, and sort of look at them in a different way, with literally under a different light than they normally would see them if they were on simply on display in the exhibition. And then they learned the tools and the steps of, as you sort of asked, how do we figure out when to date something? Where we have to find comparanda, we have to find other artifacts that look and seem very similar, maybe that have similar inscriptions that were from more secure find spots that we can sort of then use as an anchor to date the objects or to put them in their right sort of historical context. And so the students learned all about those different steps. And I think what was I found to be a benefit, at least from my perspective, was I also didn't know the answer. So these were objects that we hadn't studied yet. And so I came into it with them and I said, I don't know either. Like, we're learning together here. And yes, I have a better sense perhaps of where to look to find the answers, but we are doing this together and we're going through that process together. And then we also asked students to develop service learning projects, right, that sort of gave back. So we gave these ideas, they worked on these ideas for public-facing engagement, and we're going to share those then with the Springfield Art Museum. And all that research is going to be shared with the Springfield Art Museum as well, so they can now have this sort of background, almost like a dossier on all the objects that they can draw on in the future.
So basically the students are doing actual history. They're doing concrete, frontier history. They're tackling subjects, even if they're kind of small and it's a specific, artifact, they are doing something that nobody has ever done before. Because, a lot of what people think history is, remembering some facts, some dates, regurgitating, the arguments of other historians, which is not an unimportant part of the history learning process. But, here at Missouri State, you're giving them the opportunity to do actual history at the undergraduate level, where they're pioneering, as it were, a collection that has just not been looked at in a systematic way before.
Yeah, I like to think of it as demystifying the process in some ways. And so you could imagine an undergraduate student coming in and the idea of, wait, these are like ancient objects and we're putting them on display in a museum. But somebody does that and you're able to do that, and sort of instilling in them the sense that the kind of agency of doing real history and this is what real history is. And it gives them that sense of being able to participate in the historical experience.
I also would add that I think demystifying is a great way of putting it, but also I think it shows them how delicate historical knowledge is and how we come to it, so they understand how we build facts, how we interpret things, how we base those interpretations on evidence, on data. So it's not as though somebody just came in and said, oh, this is the date. We actually sort of develop evidence and build an argument together and sometimes we don't have the answer, right? Sometimes we're like, maybe it's 12th century, maybe it's 8th century. And this is why we think one is a better date than the other. And a lot of times in the exhibit, you'll see a lot of question marks, a lot of places where we don't have information, and that's okay. And I think sort of helping students accept the fact and sort of learn that it's okay to also not have a definitive, this is the correct way, this is the sort of pure answer, is a sort of powerful experience in and of itself.
Could you give us an example of one of the artifacts that was perhaps that you couldn't find a definitive answer on?
Yeah, so the other Ushabti. So I mentioned the Ushabti that has this great, translation that allowed us then to identify where it came from and sort of where it was excavated. But the other two are really difficult to read. So there are inscriptions on them, but it's very difficult to read, and we can date them roughly, but it's really difficult to tell even for certain, the material in one of them, because the ancient Egyptians like to make things in stone and pretend it was faience by painting it to look like faience, which is a type of glassy ceramic that the other one is in faience. And so that was one where we really kind of, threw our hands in the air a little bit and said, we know it's roughly 26th dynasty, but beyond that, I don't know where it came from, and we know what the object type is, but I can't really say much more than that. Even though it's something, again, a really common artifact type, we can't say too much more about who used it, why they were using it, why they picked this piece, where it came from, where it might have traveled in antiquity. And so that was one of the places where you had to kind of just let the question mark stand.
What level of success did you have with interpreting some of these objects, or the collection as a whole, I suppose? I mean, some of these objects you have very little information about, and some of them it sounds like you gathered quite a wealth of information. Is there like a percentage, or is there some way you could convey the success you guys have had with this project?
Yeah, I would say overall, actually pretty well for the most part. Again, I like, and actually the museum, Sarah, who's directing the museum, really liked the fact that we were using the question marks because it's honest in some ways. But I think for the most part, some of the pieces that were chosen, I think we had enough diagnostic information about them, right? Enough to be able to figure out what they are, that I feel pretty confident in for the most part about being able to identify, and at least the part of the thing, right, is that we don't know for many of them the exact find spot or the archaeological context, which is a whole other issue. But in terms of identifying the type and the date and the style and the culture and all of that, I feel was pretty successful in being able to locate that information.
Yeah, and I'll add that our work builds on the staff at the Springfield Art Museum and the work that they've already done. So that includes Sarah Burr, who's the curator. That includes Kyle Clymore and Bryan Fickett, who we'd been working with, and everybody else at all the other staff and volunteers and people who had worked there before us. But the registrar already had a lot of information that then we built upon. So even if we didn't know, we found out more information, but we know where, who is bequest from, and we have a sense then we can start tracing. It's a starting point to start tracing the object history. I think we did a pretty good job. And honestly, some of the more challenging pieces that I had really big question marks next to, we just didn't put on display yet. So there's still more. There's a future exhibit somewhere out there. The objects that were really confusing to me, we just said, we'll do that next time.
Our future students.
Yeah, our future students. Exactly.
That brings me to my next question pretty perfectly. What is the logical next step for this program? You mentioned having taken students to other museums previously, and now you're creating your own exhibition. What do you see? What is the next step in this program?
Yeah, so I would love to write up a catalog of the objects that we have in the Springfield Art Museum, have student input on that as well, make that accessible. I also will add that we're making the opening text and the closing text accessible in both Spanish and Arabic as well, because we think that's an important component of this. So when talking about accessibility, we're not just talking about Springfield, Missouri. But we're also hoping to take students, or the next level would be to take students to these areas and sort of work with artifacts and collections in the sort of place in which objects are found. And we're hoping to do that. So we're working on a study abroad project, hopefully for maybe 2024 or 2025 rather, that will take students to Greece, probably Athens, Rome, and parts of Egypt.
You mentioned there were some of the objects that you didn't put on display yet and you plan to look at in the future. What was confusing about those objects? What kind of objects are they? And, how are you going to go about dealing with the confusion with these particular objects?
Yeah, so one object in particular was just an object type I wasn't familiar with the decoration that was on it. So it was like a large bowl, but it had decoration, Egyptian Hathoric goddess imagery on it, but it hadn't seen something quite like that. And there are things that are unlike other objects in antiquity, but I just didn't have the opportunity yet to do enough diagnostic work to feel comfortable putting it on display. So my next steps would be spending a lot more time with the objects, like really sort of asking the museum to let me look at the objects for a lot longer time period, so that way I can get a better sense of it, that feel that Bryan sort of spoke to before, and then to talk to my colleagues in other museums. I have a lot of colleagues who work as curators or education specialists at the Met and at the Harvard Art Museum and the MFA in Boston, and they have some incredible Egyptian collections that I can hopefully use their expertise for.
Yeah, and there were a few objects that we're not entirely sure why they were included in their collection of antiquities, because they're not replicas and they don't seem to be ancient, some Ethiopian stuff and stuff like that. And so that's more finding a better home for those within maybe other collections within this museum, and where they might fit, because they're not exactly ancient objects, although connected in many ways to some of the other objects. And so we understand perhaps why someone might have thought they fit within this realm. And so that's part of the reason why some of those weren't included as well.
Right. One of the objects is a really beautiful, what I think is an Ethiopian Coptic cross necklace. And it's really beautiful, but probably anywhere from medieval to fairly contemporary. And it's Coptic, which is a Christian church that has its origins in Egypt. So it does have some connection to Egypt, but doesn't seem to fit quite with our framing of this exhibit as ancient artifacts abroad. But certainly is worthy of further study and display, but maybe just in a different sort of context or with a different story being told about it.
Can you remind us again where and when this exhibition is taking place?
Ancient Artifacts Abroad will run December 9th through June 16th in the Springfield Art Museum's Hartman Gallery, with over 30 artifacts on display that have never been seen before in Missouri. And as always, admission is free.
Thank you, Dr. Troche and Dr. Brinkman, for joining us, and thank you, listener. This has been Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. Catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News, and find this episode and our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.